It's not that America is ill-founded. America at that time could not anticipate the arrival of old world values into the new world. And the real challenge is, how do you have old world values in the new world?
And good afternoon, all. Welcome to Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy for today's 2020 Constitution Day lecture and conversation, the first one that we've ever done online, but delighted to have you here joining us for the next hour, or maybe even hour and 10 minutes, depending on our Q&A section. I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful dean here of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and it is an annual tradition to celebrate Constitution Day. We usually do it here in our Wilburn Auditorium with a speaker of some renown. Oftentimes it's today's speaker, the great Dr. Gordon Lloyd. But today, of course, we are doing this online. I know that we've had a lot of registrations for today, and so I want to let you all know that we are recording this session, and it will be made available to all of you who have registered via email. We will send you out the link within 24 hours of today's conversation. Again, the Zoom rules are as usual. We ask you to mute your microphones, but we are taking advantage of the interactivity of the Zoom platform. And so we are going to be offering a question and answer time towards the end. The format for today's lecture and conversation is as follows. Dr. Lloyd will begin with some introductory remarks and comments based on the title and theme that he has created. What have we remembered about the Constitution, and what have we forgotten? His remarks will be followed by an interaction between me and Dr. Lloyd, and then we will open it up to your questions, and Dr. Lloyd will be providing answers. All questions can be submitted through the chat feature here on Zoom, which I'm sure you know by now can be seen at the bottom of your screen. Just simply click on that chat feature, enter in your question, and we'll get to those towards the end of our time together. So why don't we get started? Dr. Lloyd is the Robert and Catherine Doxson Professor of Public Policy Emeritus here at Pepperdine University in the School of Public Policy, taught here for many years, including our core course, Roots of American Order. His latest co-authored book, How Policy Became War, 2019, is one of 3 books that he's co-authored with David Davenport, former president here of Pepperdine and a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. He's also edited a number of books on the American founding and economic thought, including The Essential Anti-Federalist, Debates in the Federal Convention of 1787, The Essential Bill of Rights, and The Two Narratives of Political Economy, as well as several more. He is the creator, with the help of the Ashbrook Center and through the Ashbrook Center, of 4 highly regarded websites on the origin of the Constitution, and I couldn't promote them more highly or encourage you to check those out. They are great educational resources about some of the subject matter that we'll be covering today. He has received many teaching, scholarly, and leadership awards, including admission to Phi Beta Kappa, the Howard White Teaching Award here at Pepperdine University. As I said before, he has often given our Constitution Day lecture, and I couldn't be more happy to have Dr. Lloyd back with us. And so with that, I will stop our screen share, welcome you here into LC 155, and Dr. Lloyd. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. As usual, you do a tremendous introduction. And if I may say so, you remembered many things about me. and fortunately, you've forgotten a number of things about me. So thank you for the remembrance and the blessings of liberty upon you today, sir.
And upon you as well, sir.
If you read your Los Angeles Times today, you wouldn't notice it was Constitution Day. There is no reference whatsoever to Constitution Day. And I suspect if you did a cross-section of newspapers across the country, you wouldn't notice that the Constitution is around all the time, even though it wasn't commemorated in today's newspaper. What I want to do in terms of introducing our topic, because I'm really interested in what Peter said about conversation. I want to know what's on your mind. I want to know what's on Pete's mind. Something's always there on Pete's mind. You're trying to get below the surface into the real thing. And Cheryl Brubeck, but what's the real thing, Pete? You want to know, go deeper. And so I'm more interested in conversation and what you have to ask and what Pete has to ask. So let me, by way of lecture, suggest that one of the themes I have been returning to time and time again, and this includes the Ashbrook Center websites that Pete correctly mentioned, is what do we remember and what do we forget? Today, we should be remembering Constitution Day, but somehow we forgot it. But we really don't forget it because the Constitution is always there, and some issue is going to come up tomorrow, which says the Constitution permits or the Constitution doesn't permit. But this is a day to reflect on the Constitution. Many presidents have not even mentioned it either in the past. A lot of times it hasn't been talked about. I remember the first Constitution Day talk that I gave here was joint with Doug Kamek and Ken Starr of the law school. So we did a joint one. And I remember Doug Kamek looking, I think it was the second year that it was in business. Constitution Day was being remembered. Second year. And so one of the questions that came up to Doug Kamek dealt with is, well, what kinds of topics have been discussed on Constitution Day? And he looked through a list of last year's topics, and one of them was, is Constitution Day constitutional? I will always remember that as a sort of a jumping off point for talking about something that is, it seems to be always with us, but we never remember it, if I might put it that way. And one of the website ideas that I tried to capture was that sacred ground at Philadelphia, where you've got Independence Hall, and then you go out to Market Street. And on the one edge of Market Street, looking at Independence Hall, was Robert Morris's townhouse, which is one of the nicest houses in Philadelphia at the time. And that's where George Washington stayed during the time of the convention. And when the government moved from New York to Philadelphia, that became the president's house, or when they moved to Washington, it became known as the White House. So that's George Washington's place and the first sort of presidential house. Right down the street was another house, Mrs. House's boarding house. And there were many women involved in running boarding houses because they knew how to keep men in shape. And they got a license, a preferential license, so that they could take care of themselves. And Mrs. House had two houses. One, this is her boarding house, another one was the Indian Queen Tavern, which is just down the road, where a whole bunch of delegates stayed, and they talked after hours. So what have we remembered about these three places? Because they're all heavily involved in the Constitution, both directly and indirectly. The Constitution written in Independence Hall, right across the street from these three places. So what have we and what have we not remembered? Well, I started collecting this in the 1980s in commemoration for the 200th anniversary. And at that time, at the end of Market Street, two buildings, and they were both, we're all adults, and I can say what it is. It was bathrooms. One was a male bathroom, the other one was a female bathroom. There was no indication at all that the female bathroom was Robert Morris's townhouse or the White House. There was a commemorative plaque on the Constitution, excuse me, on Madison, on the mail. The plaque says, James Madison lived here, or served here one time. It's a plaque.
On the bathroom.
On the bathroom. And then 2 years later, I mean, I keep going through that. 2 years later on this, I see that the plaque has been removed. And on this place is where the first Philadelphia law school or law things were presented. So Madison was moved, and you could tell what kind of job they did to remove it and replace it. So we come now to the 2000s. That's sort of the 1980s. It cleaned up Philadelphia. So they remember some things with cobblestones, but these places are gone. So I come back in 2000 and keep looking at this. Well, Robert Morris's townhouse is no longer a woman's bathroom. They've moved those. But what is there is a permanent remembrance of slavery. And the idea is that what this country needs to remember is that the first president of the United States had slaves. And so right there on that corner, what we have forgotten is this was the executive branch. Now what we have remembered is that this is a commemoration of what the guilt, the sin, the original sin of America being slavery. And it's open. I mean, it's not you don't go and open a door to everything is open. There's 24 hours a day. And just down the road is Graf House where Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. And that is commemorated and it is remembered. Now on this site, however, Washington is slashed now. So you've got a hero who is removed. This whole monument business is nothing new. It's been going on for what goes up, what comes down, what do we remember, what do we forget? And across the street from this is the visitor center. So that's where the bathrooms are now. In front of the visitor center. On the front of the visitor center is Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence, which is a condemnation of slavery. And along with it are people like Beecher Stowe and Frederick Douglass and the women's movement of 1848. So, quote, bringing up to date or making it in modern language, the same principles at the beginning. So look, on that corner, you have remembering what the Declaration, the spirit of the Declaration stands for, and through the ages. And across, America's original sin will rub it in your face, right in the face of the Independence Hall and everything, right? All right. So what has happened to Madison? What's happened to Madison is that it has been just like knocked down, and two things have happened. One is a huge slab of modern East Berlin concrete. We're on the ground, right? And what does it say? This is where you can virtually say whatever the heck you want to say. So democracy is no longer representative democracy, no longer thinking, reflecting, conversational, deliberating, compromise, civic virtue, etc. It is utterance.
Individual expression.
Individual expression on this slab of concrete. The irony, of course, is it has the First Amendment right on there. And the irony, of course, is that James Madison wrote the darn First Amendment. Right, but there's no memory of James Madison. And so the other part of this building is now a metro stop for the Philadelphia metro station. And to conclude just a little bit, what about Mrs. House's Indian Tavern?
Yeah.
It's Fox News Center. And yet there are cobblestone streets. that been remembered, buildings have been restored, the Constitution is still kind, plexiglass and everything is conserved. So there's a little story I thought I'd tell you about. And you think, well, that's not exactly words of the Constitution, but it has a lot to do with me with regard to what we remember and what we forget, and how we remember it and how we forget it, and how important is that. And it's a statement somehow of what the current generation think is important and want to pass on to the next. But the next generation comes along with its own issues, and it either wants to change the past or try to imitate the past.
Yes.
The building where the slavery thing is really to rewrite the story. And that, I think, was done right around 2000. It was very controversial. But the fact that it's there has, I think, in my opinion, given credence to the 1619 Project, to Howard Zinn's book on America, and it has created a certain tension within the American soul, about whether we're good or not. Whether, and the question for me, was this: is America ill-founded?
Yes, very good.
Right. So if the 1619 Project would say yes, it is ill-founded, not just imperfectly founded, but ill-founded. Across the street where you've got the women's movement, et cetera, and Douglas, they're saying that America was imperfectly founded, but gave the opportunity, the Constitution gave the opportunity for the expansion. In other words, the founders are founders. The founders are not finishers.
Very good.
And so if this to be an American story, the story is, what have we done with, what have we remembered, and what have we not remembered about the Constitution? I have not, so far, gone straight for the words and language of the Constitution. I've tried to give you a background of what it is that we remember, to try to get you into thinking about the Constitution itself.
Yes. And to your point, are we remembering and taking the so-called spirit of the Constitution, or are we identifying the process, right? So I take your point about that slab of East German concrete being put up there with the First Amendment, which was created out of deliberation, of course, but it is essentially meant for people just to freely express themselves individually, whereas the founding itself was a deliberative process.
That is correct. And I think that tension in the understanding of democracy produces a tension understanding of the Constitution. So to say, is the Constitution ill-founded or not, means to raise the question, is the Constitution democratic?
Very good.
And then what does democracy mean? And I think for the founders, democracy, there are two ways. One is a terrible way of understanding democracy, which is you get everybody gathered in a street and they start yelling off with his head or whatever. In fact, Madison has this very famous phrase in the Federalist Papers: if all Athenians would be a Socrates, it would still be a mob. So there's something about gathering on the spot, which is mob-like. There's something about just individual expression, which is just uttering, shouting rather than deliberating.
Yeah.
So yes, democracy has become much more crassy by the demos than it is reflection. Madison's phrase of it is the deliberate sense of the majority. That is, the majority itself is not necessarily deliberative. You must set up deliberative mechanisms in order that the majority might govern sensibly.
So I'm just thinking, when we see the riots and protests in the streets and they're saying this is what democracy looks like, in a sense, they're right.
That's correct. That's old.
The founders would say, this is right.
That's right, and that's what is wrong.
That's what's wrong.
That's right. Why don't you go and talk? Well, we're tired of talking.
Yes.
We're tired of talking. No one listens to us. Well, set up the mechanism so people do listen to it. You improve it. Maybe your voice wasn't heard then, but maybe your voice will be heard now. Well, we're tired. Well, we're going to go to the street. Well, why do you go to the street? Well, people will finally listen to us. It's like a kid. People will, my parents will listen to me if I break something. But if I talk to them, Mom and Dad, I want to do such and such. Right? Now, the parents could do it the other way. We want you to go to church. I don't want to go to church. I'll tell you what, we'll go have a pizza after. Oh, okay.
Persuasion.
Persuasion. Now, some of it is a bit low, right? But if you're going to have consent of the governed as your premise, which is your claimed premise, then you're going to have some disagreements, and some people are going to get very disagreeable. And I think the key to the Constitution is that it works out a mechanism whereby grievances can be expressed and discussed. And there's always the opportunity for an election in 2 years' time, yes, or 4 years' time. So consent of the government is linked to elections. So part of the critique of the constitutional history is that elections really haven't been open and free. So at the beginning, so goes the criticism. At the beginning, only rich white men could vote. How can you call that consent of the governed? Then slaves, blacks got the vote, but there was Jim Crow, which then restricted the vote. Then women didn't have the right to vote. Then such and such didn't have the right to vote. Well, it changed, didn't it?
Yes. Within the system.
Within the system, that is the point.
Creative.
And the Constitution includes amendments.
Yes.
And therefore.
And elections.
That is correct. Includes elections. That Madison in Federalist 51 says elections, no doubt, are the primary way in which the system is controlled, right? However, we need auxiliary precautions. Is his phrase. And what kind of auxiliary precautions do you need? Well, one branch is elected for 2 years, another one for 6 years, another one for 4 years. You've got, they're staggered. That doesn't mean say it's undemocratic. It's staggered. You've got these various mechanisms, and then some are not even written in the Constitution, but have become accepted, some of which I don't particularly care for. But it's constitutional because it's not unconstitutional. Right? For example, today, many people object to the filibuster.
Right.
The word filibuster is not in the Constitution.
Yes.
But there's nothing to stop the Senate from having one.
Right.
And there's nothing to stop the Senate from not having one.
Right.
It's a tradition that has grown up within the constitutional framework, capable of being changed within the constitutional framework.
So when my good friend, as it was announced recently, apparently there's a group of Democratic leaders who are putting together plans to eliminate the filibuster after this forthcoming election on social media, which I know you love.
Absolutely.
My good friend Rick Hassan, election expert, says, well, the filibuster was never in the Constitution. That doesn't really capture. He's trying to make an argument that because it's not in the Constitution, then it doesn't really belong there anyway. But as you're saying, it doesn't negate it. So it's still the option of the Senate to either use it.
Well, the language is the Senate can control its own rules and regulations.
Yes.
And the Senate has chosen, maybe unfortunately, has chosen that as part of the system of restraint, etc., a supermajority.
Yes.
And that is always a tension. If you want majority rule, why don't you have majority rule? Why must you need supermajorities or 2/3? And that gets us back into the issue of majority, yes, but under certain conditions as an auxiliary precaution, 2/3. Example, the president can veto laws passed by the Congress, bills passed by the Congress. Well, the monarch could veto laws passed by the colonies, but there was no way that the elected branch could then overturn the monarch. Under the Constitution, the elected branches can respond and overturn but not simply by a majority, by a 2/3.
Yeah.
Now, that could change. You could just write an amendment which says a majority, or you could say that the president can't veto. Most state constitutions did not permit the governor to veto.
Mm.
Most state constitutions required the governor to be elected by the state legislature.
Mm.
And so one of the tasks at the Constitutional Convention was to try to create a stronger executive without having it fall forward into monarchy.
Mm.
And one of the ways of doing that was elections. And the second way of doing that was the veto, overturning the veto. And ultimately, if you couldn't wait for 4 years, there was impeachment. All of these mechanisms in the Constitution, if we want to pursue with your friend about the role of the judiciary, the phrase judicial review is not in Article 3 of the Constitution. So if we are being literalists, which is kind of funny for liberals to be literalists, but it's cute. So if you're being literal, the Constitution does not bestow judicial review power on the courts, if you're being literal. Of course, so where did judicial review come from? Well, judicial review as a phrase, judicial review, was produced by a law school professor called Corwin, describing the role of the judiciary. And so if you're really being literal, of course, judicial review isn't going to be there because it wasn't invented until 100 years later. Yeah. But is there a phrase in there that is the equivalent of judicial review, so that judicial review is a shorthand for what is there? And the answer is yes. Yeah. So I think the word electoral college is not in the Constitution.
Yeah.
Okay, but that doesn't mean to say it is abhorrent to the constitutional framework.
Right.
The constitutional framework is an attempt to slow things down. Mm-hmm. It's like a, to me, it's like a good friend if you've been drinking. And a good friend.
Which does not happen here on campus, by the way.
No, that's why we're off campus.
That's right.
That's right. But moreover, you're not my good friend. So it's like a good friend telling you. Yeah. Of course, we don't drink on campus. I know that, but you had to get that in there. Yeah, right. I understand. Maybe it was a bad example, but we were talking the hot-headedness, yes, or the lack of decorum, or the lack of sense that often comes across a majority, yes, or often comes across a person. And if they'd only sleep on it, yeah, or wait until tomorrow, then they may make a more reflective decision and don't speak too fast. So that's what I'm trying to get at. So yes, that's what the Constitution, I think, provides. And the issue for the left is that anti-democratic? When you tell somebody, sleep on it, I'll give you the keys tomorrow, yeah, but you're going to sleep on it tonight. Or is democracy, I want my keys, I have it. Yeah. And I think that is the danger of Twitter, of social media. It doesn't give you a chance, or discourages the chance of thinking, and it encourages action.
Mm. Boy, that's so true, right? I mean, I hear so often this emphasis on action. And in some ways, the Constitution was created out of a spirit of wanting to see greater action, yes, right? Leading from the Articles, yes, and moving towards something where there would actually be greater power residing in the central, in this case, federal government. But at the same time, also understood the perils of human nature, yes, and the qualities that you just said, that when we don't force ourselves to deliberate, chances are we can make really terrible decisions.
That is correct. So how do you move from no action to sensible action? And every time the word sensible comes up, there is an instinct among a number of people to say, you're trying to control me by making me behave in a certain way. And the answer is yes, in a certain sense, that is true. That is true, but you can change those rules if you have the capacity to persuade.
Mm.
And well, what happens if I don't have the capacity to persuade? Well, I guess the game's over. And it seems to me that it's not that people quarrel in the United States, that's the issue. The issue is when the game is over, or when I should not use the word game because that gives it away, but when the argument is over, when everything's done, do you shake hands? Do you accept the outcome?
Very good.
And for example, there was a huge debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. But when it was over, there was a shaking of the hands, and the Anti-Federalists, many of them joined the new government in order to restrain it.
Mm.
And I think that's learning about politics, learning about deliberative politics. Can you accept the outcome? And that leads me to the serenity prayer.
Yeah.
How do I accept something that I don't necessarily like, and that becomes very, very troublesome.
Yes.
Very troublesome indeed. And I think part of the democratic process, or the constitutional process, is providing a mechanism whereby deliberation takes place, and hopefully you can come to a decent outcome, and it still gives you time 2 years from now to try to muster enough support to do that. But saying like, it's almost like in baseball, wait till next year.
Yeah.
But if you could say, wait 2 years.
Yeah.
Right? And then the mechanism is, all right, so within those 2 years, I have managed to overcome party affiliations. I've managed to overcome all of those kinds of things. And I now have a majority which says, I want to reintroduce slavery.
Yeah.
Now, there's a certain sense in which if you do that, you're disgusting. Disgusting, terrible. But if you can't do it, you're not democratic. Unless we apply a moral standard to democracy, which is not simply procedural,
Yes.
which is not simply counting the votes,
Yes.
which is not simply turning out the vote.
Yes.
It is being decent. So can we be decent and democratic? Because we're democratic doesn't mean to say that we're decent.
Yes. That's right.
And because we're decent doesn't mean to say that we're democratic. So the challenge is to be decent and democratic. So you control the House, you got it. But you don't control the presidency yet because it's still 2 years away. And you only control 1/3 of the Senate.
Yes.
So if you are determined to be nasty and disgusting in the most heinous way possible for the American regime, and you push it, and then the next time you repeat in the House, you get your winners again. And this time you get another 1/3 in the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And the presidency is up.
Yes.
So now you have the ability to pass a law which does that. The last remaining hope is the Supreme Court.
Yes.
But in the meantime, 3 Supreme Court justices have died.
Mm.
And how do you get my drift?
Yes. Yes.
And so there's a very delicate way of how do we be decent and democratic? And so that democracy must have some moral fiber to it. Slavery is wrong.
Yes.
But because slavery is wrong doesn't mean there are a lot of wrong things, but that doesn't mean to say I can get away, I can do away with it overnight.
Yes.
So do I put slavery in the course of ultimate extinction?
This is good. Keep going.
And is that good enough? as a moral premise.
Yes.
That I am going to put slavery in the course of ultimate existence.
Even if I can't do it now.
Even if I can't do it now, I am going to do my best to put in the course of ultimate extinction. Now that requires the next generation coming along
Yes.
to feel similarly or to receive instruction
Yes.
that slavery is wrong. Well, then if it's wrong, why is it still here? Well, because there's something called, to paraphrase Aristotle, good old Aristotle, wise old Aristotle. And I think Madison would totally agree with this. A politician, a mere politician, is just somebody who gets us through the day. Tomorrow is another day.
Mhm.
A utopian wants to get it done forever and ever and eliminate it. The statesman is somebody who's in between, who has values,
Yes.
but understands limitations
Yes.
and tries to work through that. And I think that is particularly important in a democracy where you have a whole bunch of people voting, a whole bunch of pressure groups
Yes.
operating, etc. It's utopianism. I think there are two dangers to watch. One is utopianism, which presumes that if something is right, it ought to be done otherwise
Today.
today.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're a hypocrite.
Yes.
And the other danger is nihilism.
Mm.
Nil, zero. There is nothing there. So all there is power. So all of this talk about the Constitution setting up certain ideals or frameworks for accomplishment is just pure nonsense. It's all about all we need to do is to ask who wrote it.
Yes.
And then we have the answer to what the Constitution means.
So I just want to pause 1 second, just as a time check. We are going to go to Q&A here in, I'd say 5 to 10 minutes. I see a couple questions that are coming in via the chat feature. Again, if you joined us a little bit late, we are going to be running probably about 10 minutes past the hour. So we have plenty of time for your questions. They can be entered through the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Just simply click on it, type in your question, and we'll get to those here in the next 10 minutes. Now, Gordon, you have just raised a very provocative idea, which could not be more timely as we read the day's news, which again is reflective of the fact that the Los Angeles Times did not mention that today is Constitution Day, yet when they report on the various things that are happening in our streets, they are essentially making constitutional commentary.
Yes, they are.
And so this separation or this juxtaposition of nihilism and utopianism as essentially being undemocratic qualities. Talk a little bit more about that and how it affects how we remember the Constitution.
Well, the utopian is, in a sense, easier to deal with because I think there has been a utopian element in American democracy, the American kind of democracy. Tocqueville is right. The title of his book is not American Democracy. It's Democracy in America.
Yeah.
So therefore, you can have democracy in other parts of the world which are going to be different than what America is.
Very good.
So I think there's something about America, an American democracy, that has a utopian streak in it. Now, whether that's linked to
A more perfect union.
it doesn't say perfect union.
That's right. So
That
there's
would be
that balance.
that's right. So the utopian would be perfect or nothing. And then the nihilist would say nothing or nothing. Forget it. It's not even worth talking about. Go home.
Yeah.
So there's something, I think, there's something about American which is progressive, which is utopian,
Yes.
which does look to get away from the old world.
Mm-hmm.
start afresh, start anew. And so and well, why start anew if all you're going to do is just go to the other side of the street? Then don't make you think that the grass is greener on your side of the street, you stupid fool. There's nothing there.
Yeah.
Don't be silly. Oh, well, I've got to. It's in my spirit, utopian spirit. It said, I wonder whether religion, the Great Awakening, had something to do with Bill McClay has talked about the importance of the Great Awakening. Other people have talked about the importance of religion in America. Tocqueville has talking about both the plus and the minus of religion.
We call it the most important political institution.
There you go. There you go. In the plus side, it provides people with thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, some basic stuff.
Yes.
Which can be accommodated by bourgeois commercial republic. On the other hand, he says there's some wild religions in America in which he thinks, I wouldn't think about seeing that in anywhere else in the world. So I think there's this wild spirit, a utopian, a great awakening. I don't know how it works itself out, but
it's there.
But it's there. And every presidential election, I'm going to change them. My goodness, when you recruit students, you don't say you're going to be better off today than you were 4 years ago. It's going to be, you're going to change the world. But just leave me alone, man. Forget that I'm here. Lock the doors. So there's that spirit of utopianism, which I think there's something wonderful about it.
Yeah.
It's hopeful.
Yeah.
The land of hope.
Yeah.
So I think that's good, but it needs to be tamed. And taming is what I think, the taming of the utopian shrew is what the Constitution does. And yet every election, some president comes up with, and we fall for it. And it's almost like a cycle. Yeah. And then we realize that there's a Constitution which constrains. And then there's a temptation to heck with the Constitution because it only constrains what we want to do. And I think the nihilist.
And the next step, I think, just to getting back to this remembering question, is that it becomes easier to attack the Constitution if you attack the founding.
Yeah, that's very.
It's one thing to say that the Constitution is delaying the current set of issues that we need to resolve right now. It's another thing to say, and really, the Constitution itself was founded in original sin. So why shouldn't we scrap it?
Yeah, right. And it's not just that. And I want to correct one. You said the Constitution delayed. Yeah. I think what it'd be filtering.
Very good. You're right.
One of the things that David Davenport and I have worked on is trying to understand that that the Constitution is a filtering system. It's not a denying system.
Yes, that's good. Or delaying even.
Delay. I mean, it's filtering. Yeah. There's it doesn't require that a Speaker of the Assembly in California wait until 5 minutes before the end of the session to introduce something to the governor, and the governor can't sign. There's nothing in the Constitution which requires that kind of behavior.
Yes.
Although it does give a deadline of midnight, and therefore I obey the Constitution. I mean, but the nihilist is more difficult, I think, to deal with because it's not so apparent. It's not part of the American spirit. It's more part of the European spirit.
Very good.
And they say Americans are like children. They still believe in God, or they still walk around. I mean, they're not 100% anymore. Yeah. It's down to 50% or whatever. But American believes in values and such and such. And Europeans look at it, how childish. We're educated, particularly the intellectuals. Yeah. And if you think about what is wrong with what went wrong, it's not so much. What went wrong with Europe, I think, is more nihilism than it is utopian. Yeah. And by that, I mean that a lot of the intellectuals, as von Hayek mentions, that a lot of intellectuals in Europe, in Germany in particular, gave up on what we might call the Western experiment in the 1880s, gave up on the Weimar Republic, gave up on all of these things. It doesn't work. It doesn't say only dictatorship works. Only action works. And so I think that is more difficult for Americans to deal with than it is utopia. We sort of expect utopianism. We expect promise. We have weddings. We have graduations. We have that kind of thing. There are some of us who graduate with BA, then an MA, then but you're going to have kindergarten graduations. What is this? What is this nonsense? So, I mean, I think we have, it's more difficult to deal with that negativity with the Constitution than and there's so much that we could talk about on this. But
I do think, and we'll get to some great questions that are coming in here in a second. I do want to get to this question about nihilism, because I think, frankly, when we look at today's headlines, we're experiencing something that when I have conversations with those who are deeply disturbed about where we are as a nation, what they're really saying is it's difficult to comprehend the nihilist in the American experience.
Yes.
And I think we're seeing some utopianism in the streets, but I think we're also seeing a great deal that nihilism is on the ascendant. And I just wonder, again, how we confront it as Americans. Now, I think one way we can possibly do that is to really come to an agreement, wherever somebody may be on the political spectrum, that nihilism, as you say, is not an American moray.
Mm-hmm. I don't think it comes naturally to America.
Very good. And that
it's learned.
Yes. And so that when we look at the Constitution and the founding, these were not nihilists. We were not founded by nihilists, I guess is another way of saying it as well.
That's right. We were founded by people who wanted change,
yes,
hoped for change, and thought they could direct it because they were enlightened.
Yes.
The key for me to the nihilism is that it rejects the Enlightenment.
Mm.
And there's a very strange kind of connection between nihilism and utopianism. Very strange. And it's that the nihilists, I think, as you say, why bother with the American founding? But then where are we going to get our values from? Well, maybe Europe. Well, that almost guarantees that the universities are full of those educated people who think all of that is just silly. And there is something about telling the American story, which sounds young and silly and innocent and wonderful, and it's all nice and good. And to somebody who has a nihilistic or a very, just say, at least a skeptical spirit, you say, oh, come on. It can't be like that. Oh, come on, the cherry tree, give me a break.
Miracle in Philadelphia.
Miracle in Philadelphia. By the way, the book that's the best-selling book that people read on what happened in Philadelphia, the miracle in Philadelphia. And I mean, and that miracle is read in two ways. One is that God had his finger in it, stirred it, and everything turned out blessed. And the other is, the miracle in Philadelphia is that human beings rose to the occasion and compromised. Mm. And compromise is something, I think, which joins, the antagonism to compromise is something that joins the nihilists and utopians together.
Very good. So that actually is in I'll bring in my good friend, Ed Biggers. Thank you, Ed, for joining us. He's got a question here about how do we get back to that spirit of deliberation? How do we encourage these more deliberative processes? And what you seem to be saying, as both the utopians and the nihilists appear to be rising in power, or at least public support, to your very good point, another way of saying where they agree is they not only agree on not desiring compromise, they also agree on not wanting deliberation.
They don't want deliberation. There's something wrong with the American story.
Yeah.
And how can, David and I have gone over this also, I have found it very, very difficult to encourage love of something that is ugly.
Very good.
If you present the founding of something that is ugly, how do you expect your young to love it? And loving it doesn't mean to say
Yes.
respecting.
Yes.
It means listening, that the generation have something to tell you. So to the question of how do you encourage this deliberation, one, it has to start at home.
Yes.
And that it doesn't mean to say that, all right, it's your turn to disagree.
Yeah.
You're right. It is that you can be able, you have respect, you know limits, you know, deliberation just doesn't happen. Scream happens. And you could see that with little kids,
Yes.
right? And you could say, well, how are you going to stop them? Well, they have to grow up.
Mm.
And growing up means then that they learn not to scream, not to throw their, as the British say, not to throw the rattle out of the crib.
Yes.
And that's learning.
Yes.
So I think that to Ed's question, learning has to take place. Learning has to take place in the family, which is a lot of things are not happening. And with the education in schools, etc. Well, you could go on and on. But deliberation doesn't seem to be encouraged.
You know, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I would say I've run into this point about the founders put slavery in the course of ultimate extinction? The visitor center's plaque, in effect, says yes. You cross the street and you see this slavery thing, and the answer is no. You go to James Madison's house and you say, what? It's Metro. And it's Fox News. Who cares about that?
Yeah.
Who cares? And you know, I mean, I could go on, but you have questions, they have questions. But I think the key is, how do you encourage deliberation? Well, you have to take it seriously. You have to take that there are rules, and rules are not just invented as hang-ups to shut you up.
Yes.
There are rules.
Or self-interested, measures taken in order to squash opponents or.
But I think in the end, you have to shake hands or you have to agree. It's one of the, and that is what, and we're losing that.
But I think what you're saying as well, which I haven't thought about it in these terms, and I know, back to your reference to Bill McClay, one of the reasons he wrote Land of Hope, and I've heard him talk about this, is that we rekindle a love of our founding and our country. And the necessity of loving what we seek to reform and make progress from, I really do think is essential. And what the nihilist does, and even what the utopian does, is in casting aspersions upon our founding and upon the process by which we wrote the Constitution, they are also seeking to eliminate deliberation over what comes next.
Yeah, that's right.
Because if you're able to sink the founding, then you're ipso facto then saying, well, and this
There's
is
no
the way.
foundation.
There isn't. And then comes history starts today with way we should move forward.
Yeah, see, that's very interesting. History is not about the past. History is about the future.
Very good, Gordon. Wow. Yeah.
And for nihilists, there's no story.
Yeah. There's only the future.
And the is grim. And then for the utopian,
Future's wonderful.
future's wonderful. Remember what our little discussion about poetry in the morning, fishing in the afternoon?
We may have to crack a few eggs on the way to utopia, but
Heck,
hey,
that's what it's like. And I think a lot of this has to do with where do you stand on the Enlightenment? A lot of conservatives have a very ambiguous position on that, because the way I look at it is between the old world and the new world. A lot of conservatives look upon it as the ancient world versus the modern world. And so what you have is sort of the story of Western philosophy is so sort of, in the beginning, they were the Greeks, and they were good. And then came the church fathers, and they blessed it.
yes,
And then came the Enlightenment, and skepticism and nihilism was introduced. And it's all downhill from the Enlightenment. So there's a certain sense in which both there's a brand of conservatism and a brand of left, which look upon the Enlightenment as a problem. So for example, a lot of the critical race theory stuff is critical of the Enlightenment. It's looking at post-modernity. When you think of modernity, you're thinking of the Enlightenment.
Right.
And there's a lot of lefties who are postmodern.
And
So they've given up the Enlightenment. And I think that's the whole point. The Constitution, is the Constitution part of the Enlightenment project and the Enlightenment experiment with all of these problems? And are you willing to go through those problems in order to have a more perfect union and a better structured institution? Pure democracy, no. Impure, yes. But the impurities are your auxiliary precautions. And the challenge, I think, for Madison is to demonstrate how we can let good stuff through and filter out the bad stuff. Is that possible?
And to do it not from zero, but understanding that he's operating in a historical context where there were several things, slavery predominant, I would argue among them, that were non-democratic, of course. But we're in place. He wasn't starting from a blank.
You see, and I think that's when I talk about the new world versus the old. I'm trying to finish a book with Jason Ross, who was a former student here at Pepperdine. And he's now on the East Coast at Liberty University. And we've been working on this project for years. But what Jason and I have come up with is that there is one feature in this new world, which is really part of the old world, and it is slavery. Slavery is not a new world phenomenon.
Right.
Serfdom, slavery has been in the world forever, but not in the new world. It has been in the old world forever. And so if I were to talk with people about a 1619 project and say, well, what have you managed to contribute to this story? It's not that America is ill-founded. I think that's wrong. But somehow America at that time could not anticipate the arrival of old world values into the new world. And the real challenge is, how do you have old world values in the new world? And you could change that into Europe. How do you have new world values like McDonald's and everything, right? Fast food and instant this into an old world which relies on tradition and fighting over a river 400 years ago. And I think if you talk about the clash of values, I don't so much think it's a clash of the ancients against the moderns as much as it is a clash of the new world and hope and a certain degree of optimism. And therefore a certain degree of utopianism, which needs to be tamed, not eliminated. Over against an old world which is tired. And sort of exhausted. At least that's a model to work with. So I think that is something that, and I think so for me, my challenge to both conservatives and liberals, or whoever out there is America ill-founded? And where do you stand on the Enlightenment?
Very good. Couple more questions I want to get to before the close of our time here, Gordon. Speaking of former students, Jason Pates has called in. And you referenced this, the challenge that social media and its lack of a deliberative quality presents to a system of government that demands both compromise and deliberation. And so the question simply from Jason is, how would the founders view? Now, the Federalist Papers were not in 140 character pieces, but they were an argument for the Constitution that were posted in the social media of the time,
which is newspapers. Right.
So it's not as if the founders were naive or not knowledgeable of using media to make arguments that would persuade public opinion. But what are your thoughts about how the founders would think about social media?
Well, the phrase delicate balance has been used and overused, but I think it's a delicate balance. How can you how can you run a country of all this length and all this width unless there's communication that goes on between? And therefore, post roads, the post office, is written into art. That's one of the powers of Congress. Okay, so what good are post roads in the mail? Keep people informed. Why, as free speech was usually put under free press, so the way in which communication was through the press, through broadsides, so that people would read. Free speech, yes, but we're not talking about standing on the slab. We're talking about, even if a pub with a drink, but there are many of them, you still have to read the darn thing. Right? And you have to think, and somebody else is going to make an argument with you over this, even if you're at a pub and that form of social media. What I'm concerned about with the social media today is you don't have to be at a pub. You can be in your own home. So you're not meeting with anybody else.
Very good.
Right? And it's right direct for you. And they're asking you to press a button which you like or a button which you don't like.
It's the cement slab.
It's a cement slab.
So no quality of. Now, there can be exchanges on social media, but you're right to say, especially in some of these platforms, Twitter being one, it's you and millions of people out there. There can occasionally, if you address a comment to someone in public, of course, you could wonder, couldn't you just pick up the phone and.
Well, that again, what is so interesting is when the telegraph came in, you thought, oh, here we go, all this instant stuff. We won't be able to talk to each other anymore. Nobody talks to each other. They're just send a telegraph. And then when the phone came in, you would say, nobody talks to each other anymore. They just get on the phone one-on-one and do such and such. God, can't you ever get off the phone? And today, we use the phone for everything but calling. We do everything else. I mean, I think each generation faces the issue. So I wouldn't just simply say, like, for example, Second Amendment. Of course, the framers couldn't even imagine the kinds of guns that have today, right? But what is the premise? Of course, the framers couldn't imagine Twitter and all those accounts. But what is the premise? I didn't say that Twitter didn't bring us together. I said there is a danger in this, that it can create lack of thinking. It can, for example, if you get a letter in the mail and it looks like, I wish to warn you about such and such. Respond immediately or you will lose your chance in line. You read that thing and you say, whoa. Unfortunately, they're closed now. I can't give them a call. I'll sleep on it. So you read the thing, the same letter. This has happened to me. You read the same letter a day after, and it doesn't seem quite as bad. It doesn't seem quite as critical or even as hopeful. It's tempered. It's tempered. You've given yourself And you're not delaying or kicking the can down the road. That's another phrase I just do.
Right.
That somehow overnight thinking or doing as much as you can and then educating the next generation to pick up the flame.
Yes.
So it's carrying the flame is the image I would use rather than kicking the can.
But isn't this, I was just reading Tocqueville today, and there's one passage.
I can't think about another dean who would read Tocqueville on a Thursday morning while thinking about, I mean, what a compliment to you,
But,
sir.
but this goes to Doug Morrison has checked in with a question as it regards to Tocqueville, and it also connects to a question here. We're going to have to wrap up with Matthew Dillon, one of our students has also raised. Tocqueville talks about religion. One of the qualities that makes it such an important political institution, he calls, is that, and I'm going to paraphrase now, it sets the goals and desires of man beyond this lifetime, which is to say, to your point about passing the baton, it actually is in some ways utopian, and I'm speaking more specifically of the Orthodox Christian faith. It sets a certain utopianism, at the same time realizes that you may not be the one to accomplish it.
Yeah, that requires a deep understanding of human nature and,
Yes.
and what fulfillment is and what your obligations are in life. And I think the closest that people come to that is being a teacher. Because there are a lot of things
Very good.
you're not going to see. And this is what part of my objection to these instant evaluations
Yes.
is that the evaluation you're getting is based only on this class and this particular course at this particular time.
And what you had for lunch that day.
Well, could well be. I wouldn't go. That's being almost a nihilist. I wouldn't go quite that far with whether you got out of bed on the wrong side or whatever, right? But I would say that an accumulation. This would be I think Madison's answer. An accumulation of these kinds of results over, let's say 10 years, let's say 5 years, distributed over a number of courses. You get the deliberate sense of the community, which would
Yes.
be the students.
Yes.
You don't get an immediate thing. You need to temper it. Now, that doesn't mean to say you shouldn't act, but it means to say before making a big decision, one ought to look at the deliberate sense of the community, or what Madison also call it's sort of the meaning of things takes time.
Yes.
Takes time and that kind of prudence is what the founding is talking about. And the prudence is nonsense to the nihilist and kicking the can down the road for the utopia.
Very good.
And that is the challenge.
Yeah.
And so what we remember or forget about the Constitution in large part turns on this optimism, pessimism. Can human beings deliberate? You and I, over the years, have in the hallways have said, deliberative democracy would be great if we could figure those things that we are capable of deciding for ourselves and those things that we're not. We both agree that neither of us could put together some kind of huge weapon. We wouldn't want to, but we don't have what it takes to put that together. But what does it have? What do we have that it takes that we can make choices for ourselves which are reasonable? And even if you disagree with my choice, it becomes more of a preference.
Yes.
But
doesn't that also demand, and we're going to have to come to a close here, doesn't that also demand a certain level of commonality? And this I think goes back to this understanding of the importance of having a degree of love and respect for the Constitution. That it is that incredible document that is at once, and certainly when you read the Federalist Papers, the founders very well understood human nature.
Oh,
But at the same time, they still understood the incredible opportunity that was before them
yes,
to create this nation.
yes. And that is the Enlightenment utopia.
Mm.
So they were, in a sense, in their sense, interested in progress. Can you be interested in progress without being a progressive?
Very good. Can you be a conservative progressive?
You can be a conservative progressive because part of conservatism is conserving what is there. And if the progressives will put it there, you're going to be you're going to conserve what is there.
But also knowing that the progress only comes from a framework.
Yeah, that's Herbert Hoover too. It's that there's something called the American tradition, which even if it weren't there before 1776, somehow it is now there. It's here, and there's a certain way in which Americans do things. There's a certain way in which we don't do things. That character counts. There's an American character of way of doing things, and one of them is accepting the outcome of elections.
Yeah.
Or accepting the outcome of a discussion or deliberation, and accepting with graciousness defeat.
Well, I don't want to accept the fact that we are coming to a close here, but there's been great deliberation, I would say,
Yes,
Dr.
sir.
Lloyd.
Yeah.
And so thank you so much for this time. I do want to let our viewers know, and thank you all for joining us here on this Constitution Day. Happy Constitution Day to all of our viewers and registrants. We are going to continue this conversation in the month ahead. Dr. Lloyd and I have been talking about ways that we can be discussing the 1619 project and the importance of a civics education that develops both, frankly, prepares conservative progressives, those that understand progress can and should be made, but it's also based within a framework, one that we are so grateful given to us by years. Stay tuned for that. You are going to receive a link to this recording. And I would only add that as great an audience as we've had here, I know that you all are connected to hundreds of thousands of others. And so we found a great way to help promote events and discussions like this is for you to share them with your networks, share them out via the link that Melissa will be sending out to you in this next day. So again, thank you, Dr. Lloyd. Thank you all for joining us here today. We look forward to seeing you here again next time live from Pepperdine and the School of Public Policy. May the, as Dr. Lloyd would say, please close this as you would.
The blessings of liberty upon you.